And Jenny,
Cheers.
it's 8:01, so
I'm gonna drink mine.
up to you to get us going.
All right, so let's bring this up here. Okay, so those of you who are really speedy, if you catch the QR code, it's going to take you to a Padlet. Actually, we're going to explain that later. QR codes are foreign to me, so I popped one on here. It's going to take you to a Padlet where you can ask your questions about mental toughness, different conversation for a different day. Hold tight, but if you want to try it out, it's there on the screen for you. As I said, at the end today, we will explain that completely for you. But first of all, with our regular note to where we're situated, and thank you to you all, for joining us on, in some parts of the country, a very snowy Friday morning. I was hoping we'd have a spring picture. We're still with the snow picture. SAID's campus, our main campus, is based in Calgary, and it's important to us to play our role, a significant part, although just a small part, in advancing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. We take a moment every time we have one of these conversations to acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Today, that encompasses the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAID recognizes everybody who makes their homes in the southern region of Alberta, and we recognize that you're joining us from many, many different places. If you're in Alberta, we cover Treaty 6, 7, and 8, I believe, but we spread across Canada, and every now and then somebody joins us from further afield as well. So wherever you are today, thank you just for taking that moment to connect with us this morning.
Thank you. Once again, I'll just throw that link in there in the chat. If you haven't followed us on LinkedIn, please do so. So, Jenny, I think I threw you a bit of a wild card this week around wanting to talk about creating a great culture or creating a winning culture. I know there's lots that we could dig into here. But my thought was, and this is a little bit selfish of me as well, because a lot's changed in the last 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And as myself and my team start to get back together face to face more frequently, you can certainly see some things haven't changed, some things have. We've spoken earlier about how do you start working on taking advantage of the last 2 years and saying, well, let's keep these pieces of it, let's ditch these parts of it. But I think a lot of organizations and teams are going to be going through this experience if they haven't already, and I'd be very curious to hear from folks in the chat. But I think there needs to be a point of intentionality in some cases around recognizing stuff has changed. Our team dynamic has probably changed. And if you're going to take advantage of this to build a really great, cool, winning culture going forward, how do you do it? And so that's, we can take care of that in 40 minutes or less. That would be ideal.
Right. Okay. Yes. So first off, if I find the answer to that, I'm unlikely to be hanging out here on Friday morning.
Well,
not true. I'll always come on Friday. Always come on a Friday. No, you bring up so many good points. And I think a couple of the key things that stood out, first of all, and for our audience, we'll hit a couple of definitions of culture in a minute. But the biggest thing I think that you said there was intentionality, and culture is intentional. And so there's a lot to be said for a group of phenomenal adults in the same place at the same time. If we're caring and we're human and we're inclusive, it's a pretty good place to work. But when we want to get to a certain target, be a certain type of company, have a certain feel to ourselves, it all comes down to culture too. And the fine line is nobody comes to work to be told how to behave. And so how do we put all that together to create the culture where, as adults, we want to come to work, we want to show up as the best version of ourselves and deliver? So yes, it is a big question, 40 minutes, we'll see how we go. I have a couple of slides. Those of you who come regularly, you know this is very unlike us, but I want to share a couple of definitions of culture with you. There are some phenomenal resources for those who are very, very serious on this conversation out there, and we can share them when we're finished. Daniel Coyle's book, The Culture Code, is one of those. And there's his definition of culture. So one of the first things that we have to get out in this conversation is this is not about writing down your values. This is not about putting a sentence on the wall and sort of freezing it in memorial and saying, this is who we are. It is if you act and live by it every single day. So culture is really what goes on when people aren't watching, when people aren't taking note. And then the other one that's quite useful is this one, where it does come down to a set of processes, and I'm quite allergic to processes. I think most of them are gross because we push people in here and we say, you will do this. And I get it. Like in a lot of organizations, you have to have the process. But what we don't want to do is take away people's individuality and creativity and all those pieces that make us human. That's the exciting part of it. But there are certain things that motivate us in the workplace. And, one of the things we get wrong is we say to leaders, motivate your people. We actually can't do that. People motivate themselves. So what do we have set up that allows people to play, to realize their potential, to discover the purpose, and then fulfill the purpose, theirs and their organization? So just finally, on the slides, if we look at it, this is how big this conversation is. We need to understand our purpose. We need to understand our values and understand if they're aligned, personally, team, and organization. We need to know what the behaviors are that will allow us to reach the culture that we want. I think we'll end up digging into that a little bit today. Are we recognizing it? We often, companies spend thousands of dollars figuring out what their vision and their mission and their values are. They put them in a beautiful booklet or on their intranet, and then nobody talks about it. Nobody recognizes it. So if you see it, can you say something about it? Can you recognize it? What are our rituals? That's one of the biggest pieces we lost in the pandemic. Every team has their kind of norms and their rituals that they do. They're not written anywhere. They just happen. So do we even know what they are and which ones we like and which ones we don't? And then what's going to remind us about our culture when we've sort of got this flow, got this momentum? And then, of course, to throw the complete wrench in the works. I was going to say spanner, that's the English version. To throw a complete wrench in the works. This doesn't stay static either. So we do have to revisit it and keep talking.
100%. So lots to dig into there. And I threw a question out to everybody in the chat because I think this will be interesting. I think it's one of the things maybe I'm experiencing. I'm not totally sure how to describe it, but one of the things when you talk about defining culture, to start with, just to level set, I think for me, if as a leader you're making the decision that you want to be intentional about shifting your culture, because I think there's two ways that this could happen. Is it organically happens as the team just gels and things come to a new norm, or do you take a moment as a leader to say, okay, this is what I want our team to be, this is where I want us to go? And I think you can do that in the context of just your team or within the larger organization as well, because individual leaders probably don't have the ability to change. You talk about the fancy mission, vision, values, culture from the corporate perspective. So thoughts on, and I'm not sure many teams do this, but thoughts on how teams can define what their current culture is. Is it as simple as asking folks, what's our culture? Right? Because I think if you want to make the move, you got to define where you're at right now to be able to say, okay, we want to get there from here.
Yeah, you know what? I love that too, because we often miss that step. We know what we think we might want to be, but we forget to look at what's reality. Where are we right here, right now? And so you're just going to pull me back to the slide deck every time today, aren't you? But I think this starting place, and this has bugged me since we decided we would throw this into a conversation, is where do you actually start? Is it kind of a chicken and an egg piece within there? So I think this one is quite useful, and it's bugging me. I think it came from the Fearless Culture organization. I think that's where this started from, and we'll check it out. We'll make sure you guys have the resources when we're done. But the chicken and the egg is, do you start with what's your purpose and what's your values, which you can see on the left there, or do you start with what's going on? And the other thing I'd pick up there, Craig, is, you know, as a leader, I'd like my team to be this. And immediately I'm going to grin at you and say, and what does your team want to be? Because we have a vision, but these are our people. And if their vision doesn't match our vision, that's a friction conversation straight away. And I think we often miss the beauty in what the team sees that we can be as well. So in all of this, I definitely see a team conversation, whether you start with that as one-on-one or whether you start with that as a whole. And that obviously depends on the size of your team too. Yeah. So the big 4 areas there, either 4 separate conversations or a big, let's throw the word collaborative meeting on there, because we do want to hear from everybody. And we know in that not everybody's going to agree either. That's another piece is, you know, I see this as really important. Yeah, no, it doesn't mean anything. Okay, so is there a place in the middle? Do we need a place in the middle, or which bucket does it fall into? And really what we're looking for is, what do we want to keep? What do we want to get rid of? What don't we like? There are things that we can't change and they're out of our control. So we have to be aware of those. And then the exciting bit, the fun part, this is where your imagination comes in, is what do we want to be? And there was years ago, there was it's called the fish philosophy, that tiny book. Most people have heard from it. But there's a statement in there that says you can't be world class if you don't start to think world class. And so in that creative part is, you know, how do we see ourselves and what does that look like? And to start with, it might be out there somewhere, but that's a fun conversation. And it's not all unrealistic either. So it's kind of a starting place in there too.
Yeah, there's a bit of Ted Lasso believe in there, isn't there?
Still haven't seen it.
I know, we're going to get you on it yet, Jenny. Some great comments here I want to come to, because you know, I'm just kind of sorry scrolling through the chat. You know, we can't lose sight of those who have joined new organizations virtually, literally building new teams, right? It comment around within our team, we got closer. Within the organization as a whole, it got more distant and siloed. So interesting, right? Because you're seeing into people's lives in a much different way over the past, right? Yeah. So that's great. Interesting question here that we could perhaps come to in a moment is that, how can you tell your boss there's a culture of fear? Comment from Michelle, great to see you, Michelle. You know, great question to ask the team. What does our team want to be? And I do think that is something as a leader, you do have to take the time to be very intentional about, right? Yeah. So there are a couple of questions here maybe we'll pop to right now before we move on to, okay, so we've had the conversation with the group, how do we get started? But, you know, this question around how can you tell your boss there is a culture of fear? And I'm going to take that from the perspective, Ricardo, that perhaps it's your boss that is creating that feeling. So Jenny, I leave the tough ones to you.
Yeah, it is a tough one. There's so many different premises that comes from. So I think the first place I always go to is that MRI, the most respectful intent. So very often our intentions don't match our impact. And what's creating the fear? So if you're in an always on results pressured environment, and that pressure is sitting on your boss's shoulders, and he feels it doesn't deal very, look at me use the word he, sorry. They, you know, they feel it, they don't deal with it all that well. Their intention is, we got to get this done so that we, you know, achieve the right results, so that we're not letting stakeholders, senior management, whoever down, and the impact is then dreadful. So sometimes that's really simple if it comes back to that. It's simply a bit of reality testing and a conversation that recognizes it. And what we don't want to do there is lay blame. We want to have that adult to adult conversation. When I hear this, I feel whatever. If it's more than that, it may be a good team conversation. You may decide as a team that you want to look at who are we as a team, how are we behaving as a team, and involve them in that conversation. It's so hard to answer that question without knowing more behind it, because it's based on that individual if they're creating that fear. If the entire organization runs on a anxiety, fear-based, excuse me, lack of human existence, I don't like saying this out loud, but then you're not a tree. I would look at what your options are there if that's an entire organization, because that's not going to get better. If that's the way it stems at the top, that's not going to get better. And that's another key thing with culture too. When we talk about organizational culture, it 100% stems from leaders. Leaders have got to role model this.
Yeah, the fish rots from the head down, right? So,
yeah.
So a couple other questions here. I think they kind of tie together. So Mihaela, what's your opinion about culture assessments or culture audits?
You're asking the wrong person.
No, I think I have a fairly good idea where you are on this one.
So, actually, it's a really interesting question. And if somebody says to me, what's a really good one, or where would you go for that? I don't know the answer to that. It's a bit like engagement surveys. Yes.
Yeah.
And I believe that 100% important piece is, what are you doing with the information afterwards? If you're just running this assessment, if you're just running this audit for the sake of checking a box, I don't do HR, but I know there's these ISO numbers and they now have measurements and all the rest of it. So you can actually use this effectively if you're going to use that information and take it and do something with it. Because otherwise, as an employee, I'm not buying into it. There's no sincerity there.
Yeah.
A lot of people have moved towards these pulse surveys. It's getting much, much easier to run a pulse survey in an organization. And those could be really, really helpful, I think, because they're quicker and they touch the mark. And then, I think if you did that over an entire organization, you're going to get some useful data. As a team, you probably don't need that. Your audit is your conversation. Here we go. We have to say it once a week. Have the conversation. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah. No, I think that's where I was going to go on this one. Is I think the word audit puts this level of formality around it that, we're going to do this formal survey. There's going to be a report at the end. But the audit can be that team conversation. And I think in essence, that's where I started here was, if you're going to have that conversation with your team as a leader and say, folks, I think we need to shift to be, we're good right now. We can be great if we look out this direction, and we need to start shifting in this way. And that's where, you went on the, where are we now? And so I think for me, the question then is, how do you start making those steps? Okay. So you've had the conversation. Where are we now? Right. We want to keep this. We want to ditch that. We know we can't change this. Right. How do you then start actually taking steps forward? Because I've been in situations where you have these conversations. They're great. You feel that was super. Right.
All right. Yeah.
And then that's it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the mission, vision, values you talk about being printed on the walls, and then you don't refer to them again. So how do you it comes back to intentionality. How do you keep this going forward, and how do you start making those next steps as a group?
Okay. So first off, as always, you've answered your own question. You keep the momentum going. Okay. So we don't win in straight lines. We don't make progress in straight lines. We do it just meanders, goes up and down and all around. The key is keep the momentum going. The other key in this is I strongly believe you want to involve your team. So this is absolutely a whole conversation. So we have to make time for that. And if it's important, it has to be seen as a priority, which means that you're talking about it even when you're not in those actual sessions. Because if we're not talking about it, there is no way our team is even thinking about it. So it does have to become your intention. It has to become your priority. Once you've had your, what do we want to create? What are we getting rid of? That conversation. The next question is, what kind of culture are we trying to create? Because if you think about the behaviors involved in a collaborative culture, it's slightly different than a learning culture, which is very different than a performance orientated culture, which is really different than a customer focused kind of culture. So that initial conversation of knowing who are we and what do we want to be is vital, which is why that piece at the beginning from you was so brilliant, because where are we now? What is reality? And where do we want to go to? Once we've decided on that part, then what is it that's going to take us there? And I think then that we're getting into the conversation around probably priorities and values. And so one of the exercises we do, we have a course in open enrollments called Engaging and Motivating Employees. And we have everybody, if we're working with an intact team, we have everybody, what are the priorities of your team? Just write them down. And it is incredible the difference between every single person around that table. And every single person around that table is committed to the best that they can do every day, but our priorities aren't aligned. So aligning those priorities gives us a framework, gives us an order of importance. And then there's another sidebar conversation that you can only have one top priority. Mm-hmm. Like really, you can only have one. We try and have 10. But priorities as a plural, I think, didn't exist until about 20 years ago or so. Like we've made it bad. And then once you've got that, what gets us to there? So if we're customer focused is a nice one to or an easier one to talk about. If customer focus is our culture, then our priority might be the customer. That means we put the customer ahead of our team meeting. That means we put the customer ahead, whatever that piece may be. It allows us to start seeing what are the behaviors that are crucial. And again, those behaviors, if I tell you these are the behaviors that I would like, well, I may as well be parenting you. Nobody comes to work to be parented. And so your team knows, they do the job. Of course they know. The skill is where we've mentioned this before too. Remember, you're the hippo. So the hippo, for those who weren't with us that day, highest individually paid person's opinion. And the minute that the hippo weighs in, we all follow. Okay, it takes a very courageous soul to stand up against that. So what we want to do is just stand back and hear it and actually listen for what are they saying as opposed to what do I want them to say. And that's not easy.
Yeah, no, it's very true. There's a lot in there.
Sorry.
So no, it's really good. And we always joke offline that I sometimes leave these conversations feeling like I was in them, but didn't participate because I'm listening to you. I'm watching the chat. I'm watching the questions. And, there's been some great comments coming through here. One that I think we can touch on a little bit later as well as from Deborah around, we have two different cultures.
Yeah.
One for operational, one for an office. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Organization is culture. Team within those organizations have their own cultures, et cetera, et cetera.
Brent, I think it's important too, though, Craig. Sorry, but I think it's important to recognize that's okay as well, and that's where we do have a power. Is if you have a organizational culture that's maybe it's taking its time to catch up. Like there was a lot of fast forwards press during the pandemic, and a lot of teams actually gelled. Like you're right, we really did get an insight into people's lives. Some of us had no choice but to say, this isn't working very well for me, or to really open up in places where we wouldn't have before. So we've seen this a lot for teams, and the organizational cultures are lagging a little bit in coming up. But when we recognize that there's different cultures and they're okay, as an individual leader with your team, you can make a huge difference. And how somebody feels at work affects how they go home, which affects their kids and their family, which actually affects our community. Because if you go home, you affect your family. If you go home and you coach a sports team or volunteer, that affects those people too. We spend a ton of time on work. So I think it's important to recognize those cultures.
It's a huge point. I like that the comment, Mahela. Hippo is the new pink elephant in the room. That's good. Deanna has a question here. Can culture be measured by risk and information sharing?
By risk and information sharing?
Correct.
So I'm not an expert in this, but yes. and often I think the reason that culture gets put to one side is, one, it's really difficult to put some good parameters. It's like learning, the constant conversation. Can you measure the impact of your learning? So it's difficult. Yes, you can, and it requires work. And we're often in denial too, which is why we don't want to take on that big role. But I think that you can see the effects of culture, and potentially you can see those effects in things like information sharing. When we hear a company say, oh, we're so siloed, nobody talks to each other. Right, well, there's only one reason that happens. What are we protecting? Why are we staying separate? Who's competing for what objective or KPI? Like, there's some easy pieces in there. So information sharing is actually an interesting one. And risk, potentially, although there's some cultures where we embrace risk. There are other cultures where we embrace risk aversion. And so, yes, you can measure it, but I think it's really key to know what you're measuring, and then look at how you're measuring it as well. And I couldn't go into much more depth right here and now on that.
Well, I think the third thing I would add to that too, Jenny, is the why are you measuring it? And I'm gonna call out Mr. Overgaard on the call here today, because he's, he always brings me back to some research fundamentals around, if you're going to collect data, why are you collecting it? What question are you trying to answer with the data? Yes. Otherwise, why bother collecting it? So, and I think that ties back to something you talked about earlier with engagement surveys, pulse surveys. Fantastic that an organization may be doing these things, but if you do them in absence of any action or feedback on the result of the survey, it's a wasted effort. It is an exercise of false involvement, is what it then becomes. Right? Don't do a pulse survey if you're not going to announce what the results were and the outcome of it. And here's what we're going to do, or here's what we won't be doing because we can't. Right? That's the other side of it. I think employees need to realize that just because you provide the feedback does not necessarily mean that it's going to be acted on.
No.
Right? So, thanks, Paul.
I was going to say brilliant. Well done.
Yeah, there you go. I got a brilliant from Jenny and a bang on from Paul. So my week is just about complete. Brent has a question here, and I think this is an interesting one too, because I think it ties into the different types of cultures that could exist. And I think as the workplace is changing, so culture changes over time and alignment with personal values may diverge.
Yes.
And the emotion be reduced for employee departure. And some context in here is that, with the low friction to change companies, has it become acceptable to be here today, move to a different company, and then potentially return again in the future, right? My take on that is it's going to depend entirely on the company and the culture of that company as it exists today. There's some organizations I know and have heard prior leaders say, well, if you quit, you're dead to me, right? Literally, I have heard that phrase. So, but I think it depends. And we are going to be there's going to be such a battle for talent in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Organizations, I think, are going to have to become more open to this, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yes. And it's interesting too, because when you look at our younger generations in the workplace, they're quite happy hopping around and holding different gigs. So I wonder if some of that's kind of a legacy piece. You leave and you're dead to me. Like, what kind of culture are we working in right there? And B, somebody leaves your organization to grow. And we assume most times they're going either for a completely different experience or a different opportunity. Then let's celebrate that we've got them to the place that they feel they can do that. And if they're going to go and gain all that experience, and then they say, I'd like to come back, and they can produce the quality work, we like what they do, enough to interview them. And, to get to interview, you're going beyond sometimes hundreds of other people, then have them back. And I think, I think the culture, you as your leader with your team, the culture is the culture. If they want to come back into that culture, that says you don't have a bad culture at all. The other piece that was interesting in there was the values part. And then lots of people, I believe, move around on a daily basis with no real idea what their values are, to the intent that they're conscious of them. We all have them subconsciously. They filter everything that we do. But we do know that people are happier, more engaged and satisfied. There's all your three great big words that you want to see in the workplace if they're working in alignment with the values. And so if those three things aren't happening for them and they're out of alignment, it makes sense to go. Like it just doesn't make sense to spend all those hours in work, we were just talking about this, to be unhappy and not to be engaged and to be bored. And so I think we will see those shifts. And, you know, I think we can embrace them so we can learn from them. We have to accept that individuals are individuals. Things shift and change. And that's part of the fluid. That's why processes are tricky, because we don't want to play in that space. We move around differently.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I once had one of my first managers a long time ago, and unfortunately I can say it's a long time ago now, you know, shared with me, he says, Craig, your job is to help your employees achieve their career goals, whether that's here or someplace else.
Yeah.
Right? And it's very true, right? You know, Michelle made a great comment here, and this is a great term for it too. I love boomerang employees. They come back because we have a great culture, which is I think what you just hit on there. So
yeah, absolutely.
Lots of great questions and comments here. One from Adrian. I've noticed that my team has its own unique culture, but teams under the same umbrella have different cultures as well. Is there a way to bridge this difference and create a cohesive culture under the same umbrella?
I think the answer to that there is a way. There's always a way. And we get these unique, you know, different brilliant cultures because we're all unique, different, brilliant people. And so can we do that with different teams? Yes, we can. What it involves in is perhaps some, you know, conversations, transparent conversations, where if we have to work together, how do we build these commonalities? How do we build the opportunities to work together? I've literally been into some organization, oh, that's the 30th floor thing. And so, you know, as you move between places, that there are these different cultures. And one of the tricky parts for us as humans, I think, is when people don't act like us initially or don't think like us, sometimes we get that little bit of friction in there. But we're here to do a job. So how do we use that friction? Intellectual tension, friction, fantastic. Social, not so good. So are we judging or are we joining them? And so then when we look for ways to join them, then it becomes easier.
Yeah. No, it's, yeah, I as always, I generally agree with you. So I was also just checking the question here as well. So this is one of those moments you caught me in the two minds, right? So
and if I didn't answer it, back again.
No, I think you definitely answered.
Okay.
So another question here from Cole. Using an economic analogy, are our emotional bank accounts in deficit right now post-pandemic? If so, do we need to actively restore those accounts prior to moving ahead and assuming that everything is as it was?
It's such a good.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the second part I'm going to tackle first is everything is not as it was, and I think that's one thing I think we have to come to terms with as teams, individuals, companies. I don't think there's any going back to March 2020. We're in a new world, right? So anyway, the emotional bank account, I love that expression. Jenny, further thoughts?
Yeah, it's one that we use when emotional intelligence, and we forget it. I think you and I were talking about this the other day, Craig. People are exhausted generally, and I'm going to talk generally here. So everybody's different. Everybody handles themselves differently. But when we look at people coming out of the pandemic, we have been through an incredible amount of stress. Some people have had incredible health problems, maybe not themselves, but within their family. We're seeing the social effects on our teenagers and on our kids. We're seeing anxiety like we've never seen it before. And, you know, to put that brave face on and pretend it's all not there and everything's fine isn't actually going to serve us at all. And so in a lot of cases, the potential is that, in fact, before we can hit this high revved version that we're dreaming of, we think we had it before the pandemic. We weren't brilliant at this before the pandemic. Some people just needed to actually come back from exhaustion, first of all. And that, for some, it's not going to be for everybody, but for some, that's coming with, excuse me, the connection that we're building in face-to-face. And so, as you said yourself at the beginning, Craig, you know, your team are convening more face-to-face. And you know, perhaps the first importance is to look at how we're operating as a team. So are we convening for the right reasons? You know, that old adage, I've just attended a meeting that could have been an email or a Zoom call. We have to make sure that we're getting that cadence right. And people need to almost recharge. It sounds a little, it's hard to say those words when we've been in this for so long. But I really think that's a huge awareness. I think that's just an amazing sort of flag and a check-in.
Yeah, no, and Mary, the comment here, observing people coming into the office are now emotionally tired.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Okay, so we talked about having the conversation about where we are. We talked about then what in terms of getting into the focusing on what's important for your team. What do you need to accomplish? I think is probably a good way of wording that, right? The big picture. I think one question that always comes to mind for me, and where this is going to be triggered, and some of you may chuckle at this because of my surroundings, but I was listening to a podcast where Toto Wolff, who's the team principal of the Mercedes F1 team, was talking about when he first went to Mercedes to interview for the job. And he walked in and he sat down in the lobby and was looking around and saw 2-week-old newspapers, old coffee cups sitting out. And he said, the first thing I said when I walked into the interview is, that has to radically change. This is not the office of an F1 team, right? Mm-hmm. It triggered for me this concept of, do you need grand gestures, for lack of a better phrase, in trying to shift culture, right? So, you know, his first thing was, if you're bringing me on, the first thing we're doing is we are remodeling that lobby of all things. But he says it set the tone for everything going forward. So I'm curious on your thoughts around that. Grand gesture can obviously differ in scale depending on, you know, your team, your organization, your division, but it still comes back to me for this point. There has to be a point of delineation from here's where the old culture ends and here's where the new culture starts. And I know it's not that simple, but.
So I think there's a couple of things in there. One, and I believe really strongly in this, do you know where your shop windows are? And so for SAIT, I am a shop window. I go into organizations and what I deliver in the day is a shop window for SAIT. It makes a difference to whether people come back to SAIT, people reach out for more, people recommend to other people, like whatever that part may be. Now, and I'm always, I hope, 100% aware and recognize there's an entire army behind any one of us that goes into anywhere to deliver. So know what your shop windows are. The foyer, the reception, whatever that piece is, very often a shop window. It's the first point of contact. If you want to go down in the weeds, your email subject line is a shop window. We have shop windows everywhere, and they speak volumes to what people see and think. And let's be frank, if we don't know each other, what we judge. 30 seconds, done. Okay, that first impression is made. Yeah. So I think behind what we were hearing there with, I think you said Mercedes. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The evil empire. Sorry, it's an F1 joke.
that Netflix documentary is running in our house now. Thank you very much. I haven't watched it yet. But we cannot stress the importance of that. And if you as a leader in your team have nothing to do with the front foyer, you still have shop windows. And so that's a really important part of your culture. So maybe once you've done, those conversations, you've got to it, okay, our priority is this is what we're going to work on. And you've got a top priority. There are others. Just start at the top. If this is new, if this is different, if you're shifting. And really what we're doing, I like Kevin Oakes's term, we're renovating culture. Rarely does an organization get rid of everything. We're simply doing a renovation. And so where will we start that renovation? Your shop windows are actually a really good place to start that renovation. And so then the conversation becomes, what does that need to be? What does that need to look like? How do we want people to feel when they engage with us? Because how they feel determines what happens next. It absolutely does. Okay, if I feel good, I'm going to smile, I'm going to lean in. If I don't, I'm on my back foot and now I'm watching and I'm quieter. And that's just my version. Everybody does that differently, but that's how that works. And so that might be a great place to start. And so then, what if we had 3 things? Here's the 3 things that we're going to concentrate on. We'll reconvene and we're going to share our stories. Does it make a difference or not? And I steal those 3 things. Not a lot of people know this, but I used to work for the Calgary Stampede. And in their 10-day show, they had 3 things for the 10 days. And those 3 things stemmed across every single department, whether you were cleaning the bathrooms, running the rides, or super high up somewhere else. 3 things. But they talked about them all the time. They recognized people based on them. Their return rate, pretty fantastic for a 10-day show.
Yeah. The piece around, there's so much good in what you just said there. But the last thing that you touched on is talking about it all the time. I think, even from a sales and marketing perspective, we know you've got to get a message out 6, 7, 8, 9 times before your target hears it and maybe remembers it, right? Yeah. Yet in a lot of organizations, we tend to think, well, we've had 1 meeting and spoken about it and we're good to go. Right. Yeah, and it's just not the case. And I think leaders sometimes shy away from continuing to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, or finding different ways to talk about the same message because, they fear just sounding repetitive, but repetition is important. So we're getting close to time here, Jenny. And I think there's a couple things we wanted. Yeah, it's 8:44 already. A couple things we wanted to highlight before we move on. First of all, this was a great reminder from Jenny that this was our 25th anniversary today.
Oh yeah.
Episode 25. And okay. I kind of chuckled and said, "Oh, of course Jenny would remember and I would not." So that's consistent. The second thing I would like everybody to do, and you will see more communication come on this, is put a date in your calendar of June 16th. Yeah. We're going to take this show live. We are planning a 1-day Leading Beyond Any Title leadership conference that we'll be hosting at the SAIT downtown campus. And so you'll see information coming up on ticket sales and so on, but it will be a fantastic opportunity. Jenny will be joining us. Gina, who has been on, will be joining us as well. And Ela Edgar, another one of our fantastic facilitators. We have a tremendous day in the works. So we're looking forward to that. Jenny, that'll be June 16th once again. Yeah. So let's move into our wrap up here. We can come back to either the QR code if you like, just to get folks on that question while we go to the wrap, or go straight to the wrap. Your call.
Okay, let's see where the slide deck takes us. It might dictate what happens next.
And so for the questions that we did not get to, we will again try to get to them in the follow-up material.
We will. Oh, I didn't turn white today. So as always, our aim is to leave you with one big idea, 2 things that you can use straight away and 3 questions to noodle on. And don't run away too quickly. That link is at the end. We'd love your input. Our next conversation is May the 6th, I believe. And we're going to answer your questions, basically. The page is blank until we hear from you. Before we get there, our one big idea, I did mention this earlier. I think we need to really tie in, believe that the experience, the culture that we create at work impacts so much further beyond. Generally known as that ripple effect, it does. It has a knock-on effect everywhere. And, you know, our kids, that's why it's not one of ours, that's just a child off Unsplash. But they're affected by the cultures at work. And so this is really, really important. A couple of things that you can do straight away. So in true fashion, there's way more than 2 applied strategies here. But I mentioned right earlier on today that play, purpose, and potential motivate us. There's a great HBR article on this. But if you want to incorporate play where people get creative, they learn at work, here's several ways that you can do that. We hear lots of you, maybe there's someone here today, who bring their team to these conversations. You'll hang out, have coffee and listen, and then discuss it afterwards. What a great way to learn. Okay, what do we agree with? What did Jenny say that's like, yeah, no? But those are good conversations that provide that opportunity for creativity. Fika is social capital, simply getting to know each other beyond the job title. And embracing laughter. As adults, we don't do it enough. Any which way you can allow it and have it, please do. And the second one there is purpose. Again, you can see the ways lots of this came up today in our conversations, actually. So that would be a good piece within there. We didn't talk about what you're measuring. If your team is measured on certain metrics, that culture has to be able to match with them. Otherwise, you're in competition. It's going to take a long time if you're competing against the measurements. And then finally there, what is people's potential? So are we giving space for that? If we can bring that in weekly, monthly, we're easily going to up that involvement and that engagement. That emotional bank account is a great way to lift it by adding play, purpose, and potential. And then the second one, this comes up in most of the culture books that I've read for sure. And that is, are you picking up the trash too? And so we don't want to ask anybody to do anything that we wouldn't do ourselves. And are you modeling that? So in all those behaviors that we create, we talk about that will form our culture, can you live by it as well? Can you see it and recognize it? If something's not happening, are you just going to tolerate it, or are you going to take action? Because at the end of the day, culture is simply about the choices that we make. And those choices happen time again, every single day. The 3 questions for you to noodle on. These are sort of starting points that might help you as you reflect as a leader, and then take that conversation to your team. We can't say it enough. Involve your team, have them together. Deborah just caught your thing in the chat there. Fika is a Swedish term for connection and building relationships. When we send the deck out to you, I'll make sure that that's in down the bottom, and then everyone will have that reference.
Quite
And
possible
then
it could be a shelving unit from IKEA as well. Just
there's actually a cookbook in IKEA in the food section that's called Fika, and it's cake recipes. So in Sweden, they stop for coffee and cake, and it's called a Fika break.
There you go.
And it's way nicer to say than social capital. Social capital sounds a bit okay, and then here we are. So there is a code. I'm just going to pop it in the chat here. If you click on the link that's in the chat, that will take you to a Padlet. It's an online collaboration tool. In that Padlet, Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you press the plus sign down the bottom, it will let you put a comment in there. And what we're asking, May the 6th, when we come back, you asked for more on mental toughness. So we're asking you, what do you want us to talk about? What are your questions under that huge umbrella of mental toughness? Feel free, it's open all day. You, your team, anybody, click on the plus sign, put your question in there, and we'll build something for you on May the 6th that will cover that. Obviously, we'll be looking for your conversation as well when we come back. And then because I'm talking, I'm going to carry on. Gina's rejoining Craig on May the 18th. So those of you who were here for conflict, fantastic part 2 coming up. If you weren't here for part 1, it won't matter. Come and join her and Craig for part 2 on May the 18th.
Yes, there will be no spoilers from part 1 that ruined part 2. Or you. And that May 18th is a Wednesday morning, just so everybody is aware. And anyway, that's we're looking forward to that conversation. So once again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Your support has been tremendous. Jenny, as always, I thank you and I appreciate you for all that you bring to these conversations. And with that, have a fantastic day, folks.
Have a great Friday, everybody. Thanks, Craig. Thank you, everyone.